G'day Poetry Geeks, I'm Jackson and you are watching The Poetry Show, and in today's Poetry Show we're going to be revisiting my old favourite, W.H. Auden. Okay, I wanted to share an Auden poem with you today, mostly because you can never have enough Auden in your life. The poem is called After Reading a Child's Guide to Modern Physics. I really like that as a title for a poem to begin with, because you might think that physics is not really the domain of poetry, that they're kind of maybe at odds with each other in their goals and their aims, and also the idea of a child's guide to physics is maybe not serious or is somehow belittling of the notion of physics, or at least the poet's engagement with it. So I just think as a title it stands out immediately and demands more attention. But I'll read the poem and we can discuss it after that. If all a top physicist knows about the truth be true, then for all the so-and-so's futility and grime our common world contains, we have a better time than the greater nebula do, or the atoms in our brains. Marriage is rarely bliss, but surely it would be worse as particles to pelt at thousands of miles per sec about a universe in which a lover's kiss would either not be felt or break the loved one's neck. Though the face at which I stare while shaving it be cruel, for year after year it repels an aging suitor, it has, thank God, sufficient mass to be altogether there, not an indeterminate gruel which is partly somewhere else. Our eyes prefer to suppose that a habitable place has a geocentric view, that architects enclose a quiet Euclidean space. Exploded myths, but who would feel at home astraddle an ever-expanding saddle? This passion of our kind for the process of finding out is a fact one can hardly doubt, but I would rejoice in it more if I knew more clearly what we wanted the knowledge for, felt certain still that the mind is free to know or not. It has chosen once, it seems, and whether our concern for magnitude's extremes really becomes a creature who comes in a median size, or politicizing nature be altogether wise, is something we shall learn. It's an odd poem. Firstly, the gist of the poem, the basic things that it's talking about. Auden is kind of presenting us with this kind of almost this existential crisis that comes about from reading, if you like, a beginner's guide to physics, a child's guide to physics. The most simple expression of kind of modern physics thinking, at least in the 60s when he's writing this, seems to have brought him to a point where he's calling everything into question. Where he starts off saying, if all the great physicists know about the truth, and in the poem truth is spelled with a capital T, this idea of the great universal truths, if everything science knows about the truth be true, and then he proposes this idea that we have a better time, just our normal physical mundane human lives, than the greater nebula do, these exploding stars and dying galaxies, and there's something about the human experience which is, he feels, better than what science is describing as going on in the universe. And he uses this other image of marriage is rarely bliss. I'm married, I'm happily married, and marriage is bliss, I love it. But he presents this idea of marriage is rarely bliss. There's nothing great about marriage. You argue with each other, you fall out, divorce levels are high, all of those sorts of things. Those are the sorts of things you might be thinking. But he says, surely it's better to be in a normal, mundane, human marriage than it is to be particles whizzing around, and to exist in a world in which you are particles zooming past each other, never having that human contact that humans have. You're either in that sort of universe, or you're, if the particles do meet, it's with such force that they break each other. When we form chemical compounds, or when we have kind of nuclear reactions and things like this idea of, that kind of atomic level of activity is either incomprehensibly distant and disconnected, or it is incomprehensibly destructive. So Auden is almost saying, well, how much better to just be married, to be in a human relationship where you might fight, you might argue over who gets to control the TV remote. So there's that lovely thing. He then talks about his aging face. He shaves his face every day, and it's getting older, and it's cruel. It's reminding him of his deterioration and his demise. And every moment that it gets older, it simply becomes more and more repellent to the sorts of people he's trying to attract. But as bad as that might be, at least his face is there. He's thinking about the nature of matter and the nature of how things are made at that kind of atomic and that subatomic level. He talks about his face being having enough mass to actually be there, and not just an indeterminate gruel. You can almost imagine, if you think about the way things are made up, they are made up of atoms that in some ways aren't actually even touching. They're held together by some incomprehensible force. I mean, it's not really an incomprehensible force, but if you're reading A Child's Guide to Physics, and that's kind of the basic knowledge that you're getting, you might think of this world in which, the difference between matter and energy, or waveforms, or, at that kind of really, when you get down to the nitty gritty and you start thinking, what is it that we're made of? Are we just kind of vibrating atoms that somehow are being held together, rather than just kind of dissipating like this organic steam that, might be sentient but can't hold itself together? Shaving this aged face that he feels is betraying him is at least comforting in the fact that it hasn't dissipated, that it is there. He talks about our eyes prefer a geocentric view. Our eyes like Earth. Our eyes like matter. Our eyes think that everything that we see is all that there is, and we're happy with that. We believe that we inhabit a quiet Euclidean space. When we talk about Euclid, we're talking about the kind of simple kind of ideas of geometry within maths. Principles such as the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line. Those kinds of really straightforward, quite easy to digest understandings of the way that geometry works and the way that the world is kind of constructed of shapes in that manner. And yet, you can know about other things like projective geometry, where I talked about this years ago in the Andrew Marvell video about parallel lines meeting, and how I had a conversation, one night drunken in a pub with a mathematician who was telling me that parallel lines can meet in this kind of theoretical way. And Auden himself is saying those myths that the world is simply Euclidean have been exploded. But then he counters it with, but who is comfortable sitting astraddle an ever-expanding saddle? This idea that the universe is where we are, but it's growing and growing and growing. And he puts that in the context of sitting on this ever-expanding saddle, and I just love that. I think that's so clever and witty, and I love Auden for that reason. So the poem is full of that kind of, as I said before, this kind of existential horror at the reality of the world, but then also this kind of mundane rebuttal to all of those kind of concerns that a modern Child's Guide to Physics might raise, by just saying, but what does any of that matter? Because we're here, and we have the life we have, and okay, my face may be made up of particles that are connected in some way that I don't understand, but I still have to shave them, and it's still going to get old. And maybe the greater nebula are, exploding and dying stars, and maybe all of those things are true. Maybe there is water on Mars, if we take a really modern approach to this. But the kind of rebuttal to that is, so what? I still have my life to live, and it kind of doesn't matter if the Higgs boson, gets found, or if Schrodinger's cat is alive or not. These things are not gonna necessarily, at least in Auden's kind of dealing with it, they're not gonna matter. Now, of course, a lot of these things do matter, and they are the reason why we have all of the technological advances that we have. But that's not the point that Auden's made. The other thing I really like about this, I just wanted to talk very quickly about structure, because Auden is usually one of those poets who I really admire, because he manages to really deftly keep these kind of older poetic forms, and sometimes he reinvents forms or invents his own forms, but he's a very formal kind of poet most of the time. He relies quite heavily on rhyme and meter and assonance, consonance, sibilance, all those sorts of things that sound great. And in this poem, there are flashes of that. He has a sense of rhythm, but there are times when it becomes arrhythmic and he disrupts that rhythm. And there is this kind of half-hearted attempt at a rhyme pattern, but there isn't actually a rhyme scheme to speak of. So we get these little rhyming couplets that come together in each of the stanzas, but there's no rhyme or reason to them. They appear kind of almost out of nowhere. And I don't know, I might be overthinking it, but I think Auden is almost kind of replicating the mystery of science a little bit, and the unknowableness of science and some of the discoveries that we've made. He kind of gives us the sense in the structure of this poem that there may be a pattern, there may be a rule for when there's going to be a rhyme, or why a particular phrase is going to be rhythmic, why it's going to be followed by a phrase that's less rhythmic. But we can't discern that rule. It's almost like Auden, as the kind of God figure, the creator who puts all of these kind of physics rules in place in his poem, challenges us to be bold enough to make those scientific discoveries for ourselves in his poem. Now, I don't know if that's what he's really trying to do, but that's just something I get from the poem. The idea that it's almost a fool's errand to try and understand the structure of this poem, because on the one hand, it feels like there's intelligence behind it, but then it could also just be, random chance that made these things happen. So I think there's a kind of deeper philosophical question that's kind of being hinted at least, in the structure of this poem. Anyway, I've rabbited on a little bit too much about it. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked my rabbiting on about Auden, you can definitely check out my older video looking at Under Which Lyre by Auden. I'll put a link to it next to this video. In fact, I linked to it in my last video, so I'll just make it available. Auden is hands down my favourite poet, and Under Which Light is my favourite poem of all time, but there are some gems in Auden other than that as well. So if you're interested in finding out more about Auden, you can watch my previous video. There will be future videos about Auden as well. If you have a particular Auden poem that you would like me to discuss, I would be more than happy to jump it to the front of the queue. So leave me a comment if there's a particular Auden that you'd like me to look at. Otherwise, please subscribe. You can catch my How to Write Better Poetry series every Saturday morning, Melbourne time, and they're collected in a playlist, which I'll link to. Or you can watch my kind of sporadic analysis of poems as they come. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.